ArcSan is now digital.ai. Join us at our booth in the virtual expo hall to learn how our app protection, white box cryptography, and threat analytics solutions can help you stay ahead of the evolving threat landscape.
Welcome to the Global OWASP AppSec San Francisco 2020. My name is Amol Sarvade, and I'm Head of Security Research at CloudPassage. The title of today's session is Real-Time Vulnerability Alerting by Using Principles from the US Tsunami Warning Center. But before we dive in, let me give you a brief background. So at CloudPassage in security research, in addition to the usual product-based cloud, container, and server-based research, what we were also looking at is we were wanting to have a automated and real-time vulnerability alerting system that could alert us on the most prevalent, on the most high priority vulnerabilities. So we decided to build this system ourselves. Initially, this was meant for internal use, and now we are trying to expose this system to the rest of the world, to the greater community. So this presentation is a direct offspring of that project. So let's take a look at the brief agenda or the outline for the next few minutes. We'll we'll start with some introductions and problem definition. We will go over our approach. We'll also touch on how we designed the system, what are some of the tools we used, what are some of the platforms, languages, and tricks that we incorporated in making this system. In addition to that, we'll go over a host of example vulnerabilities that were selected by this automated system. And we'll end with some future work and some of the enhancements and some of the new features that need to be added and that we are in the process of adding to make life better. So with that brief outline, let's get started. So this is a view of a tsunami, but most of our IT professionals see this view every day. And instead of tsunami, what they see is a large group or a large amount of vulnerabilities coming towards them every day. It was the same problem for IT professional as well as our own internal researchers. And therefore, we developed this system so that it could give our own internal researchers also some guidance on what vulnerabilities to focus on and how to prioritize them. So this chart that I have on the screen right now is the number of unique vulnerabilities out there. And this goes out from 2 decades from when NVIDIA started documenting vulnerabilities to last year. If you see in the last 3 years, on an average, there have been about 15,000 unique vulnerabilities that were listed. Now, these are unique vulnerabilities. You multiply them by the number of viruses, worms, scripts, exploit packs, and you get a large amount of attacks based on the unique vulnerabilities. As you all know, like a single unique vulnerability is used by many types and many variants of viruses, worms, threat actors, so on and so forth. And multiply that by the amount of heterogeneous machines that you may have in your organization. All in all, you have on an average, as this chart shows, 15,000, which is a very large number of unique vulnerabilities. So how is an IT professional or a team of security IT professionals able to triage these vulnerabilities when you have maybe 40 to 50 new vulnerabilities coming every day, and multiply that, as I mentioned, by the number of viruses, number of worms, and number of devices in your organization? So this chart, and as I mentioned, this project was inspired by our Tsunami Tracking Center, which is NOAA, National Weather Service, US Tsunami Warning Center. And this slide that you see is that of it's a real-time chart of how many tsunamis are currently being tracked by our tsunami tracking system. On the left-hand side is the map, and on the right-hand side are even small tsunamis that are currently being tracked. And we wanted something similar. So let's, before going to vulnerabilities, let's quickly take a look at some of the tsunami facts, how they occur, and how our tsunami tracking system, the US Tsunami Tracking System, is able to give us so much accurate information on them. So essentially, tsunamis are caused by earthquakes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, and things like that. But the main thing to note is that these events cannot be predicted, but we still have a fully operational tsunami warning center. So this can be compared with vulnerabilities, attacks, and threats. Today, as I speak right now, I generally don't have much idea on what vulnerabilities will come out tomorrow, what patches would come out tomorrow, what attacks would come out tomorrow. Then how can I predict what would be the most high-profile vulnerabilities that are coming towards me? Well, let's find out. So this is a typical DART system, which is a deep ocean assessment and reporting system used by the Tsunami Tracking Center. It's made of three main components. There are these sensors that are glued or sort of attached to the ocean floor. They are held down by a bunch of anchors. What these sensors do is they record even minor tremors, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, things like that, things that have the potential to cause a tsunami. These, and there are many such sensors at the ocean floor. These sensors talk to the surface buoys through various communication mechanisms. There is acoustic telemetry, that's the most common. But they talk with these surface buoys and constantly give out data on what earthquakes, small or large, and such activities are happening at the ocean floor. The surface buoys, what they do is they collect data from these small sensors which are distributed across the ocean floor. And the surface buoys have the necessary power to communicate with the satellite. The sensors, obviously, are not that high powered. They cannot directly connect to the satellite. So the surface buoys take sensory data from the ocean floor, from many of these sensors, communicate that with the satellite, which has a bidirectional communication link to the command and control center. Surface buoys also gather information on various other things like how fast the wind is blowing on the surface and how big the surface and whatnot. And so this is an example of one of the DART surface buoys. At the command and control, the data is compiled and a lot of algorithms applied to this data based on various, well, now we call it ML and AI, but various algorithms. And that helps our Tsunami Tracking Center to communicate only the high priority tsunamis and sort of weed out all the low noise or the data that does not need to be processed. So essentially, this is similar to the problem that we have in the vulnerability land. There are like 15,000 vulnerabilities, unique vulnerabilities coming out. We need an automated system that can weed out all the noise, give us real-time alerts only on the most prevalent, the most seismic vulnerabilities. So can principles from tsunami warning system be applied for cyber attacks? Well, let's find out. The root cause for tsunamis are earthquakes, which cannot be predicted. The root cause for cyber attacks are vulnerabilities. Those cannot be predicted either. But still, real-time alerting is possible for tsunamis based on the three different parts of the system that we saw: the data collection buoys, the data point collection buoys, communication, and analytics. So let's find out if these three principles can be applied to vulnerabilities to get a tsunami-like vulnerability alerting and prioritization system that can do this automatically and in real time. So what do we need for this real-time alerting and prioritization? We need data collection. We just talked about a lot of sensors that are at the bottom of the ocean floor. Similarly, we need a lot of sensors to collect data on vulnerabilities. We need communication to get the data in, and then a lot of analytics to weed out all the noise and only give away high-profile vulnerabilities. So we took various different approaches. We were initially thinking about honeypots. Now, most of you know what a honeypot is. A honeypot is a device which is intentionally vulnerable so that you have these devices exposed on the internet at various locations. You have a couple of devices in the US, a couple of devices in the UK, EU, Asia, so on and so forth. And then since you have these vulnerable devices, you wait and you see who attacks you. And what a honeypot has is it has mechanism to record all these attacks and let you know in not really real time, but sort of almost real time on what attacks are happening, which can give you information on what's happening all over the world. We did not take this approach, one, because, and nothing against honeypots here, but this gives you a post-exploitation view. So for a honeypot to work correctly, by definition, the vulnerability has to be out. The information on how to exploit that vulnerability has to be out. There has to be malicious actors actively exploiting that vulnerability. And there have to be automated malicious scanners that have already been written that would compromise you. So honeypots are great. They have great utility, and we use them for other purposes. But for this purpose, we decided not to go with honeypots, mostly because what you get, it's post-exploitation. By the time you get the data, everyone knows that this is a big deal and you may have been already compromised. The second way, which is other extreme of honeypots, is manual tracking, analysis, reverse engineering. Now, this technique is also good, and we do it at different places on different occasions. But again, what we wanted was more of an automated system. This technique consists of getting malware samples, and then essentially reversing those samples, opening up those malware samples in reverse engineering tools, and then studying what the malware is trying to do, and getting more information about that particular virus or worm or malware or things like that. Again, this is a great technique, but we thought it's not very applicable to what we were trying to do. So finally, what we decided was we decided to go to the open source route. We decided to use public data to collect information. So our sensors were essentially public data on attacks, on exploits, on data leaks, on vulnerabilities. We also made use of various vulnerability feeds like your NVD, various exploit feeds, which tell you what the relationship between a CV and exploit. We also automatically wrote sensors to collect data from various blogs and posts and even LinkedIn and Twitter and things like that. So for the sake of this project, for real-time vulnerability analysis and prioritization, we made use of all these public data sources. So the technology that we used was pretty simple. I mean, this is just something that we used, and I think one can use any similar technology, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this. For our purposes, we used Amazon AWS. We had Lambda functions for our sensors for data collection. So we had one Lambda function to collect, for example, data from NVD. We had another Lambda function to, for example, to collect data from blogs. We had another Lambda function to collect data from Twitter. So we had various different serverless Lambda functions that acted as our data collection points. We used, we were thinking about a NoSQL database, but at that time, we were most familiar with a certain variety of database. We used that. Also, the data that we were looking at was not typically the ML and AI type of data that most people are used to these days, and I'll talk about that later. And again, for data analysis, we used various Lambda functions that got triggered on completion of data collection. So the design looked something like this. On your left-hand side, there are these various data collection lambdas. Each lambda function in AWS collected data on, as I mentioned, exploits, blogs, feeds, Twitter, whatnot. We got all that data into a database. And then once this data was completed, we had our analytics running to give us real-time prioritization and alerts. Now, this analytics engine was, I think, the heart of this project. The way it worked was we had weights assigned to a lot of Lambda functions and the data coming through these Lambda functions. So essentially, for a data source like NVD or MITRE, the weight assigned was very less or almost zero. And that's because you are expecting to find all vulnerabilities on NVD or MITRE and similar vulnerability tracking sites. So the weight for that was very less. The weight for data collected from things like exploits, where you get information on exploits and various exploit feed, the weightage was a little higher. The weightage given, and similarly, we essentially fine-tuned the weight that was given to blogs, bulletin boards, Twitter feeds, and a lot of these data collection lambdas. The analytics function was a pretty simple analytics function and a mathematical formula to calculate weights, and then come up with a score for each vulnerability or each CVE. So on the left, what you have is you have your data collection Lambda functions going into the analytics engine, and a simple weight-based mechanism to calculate the weight of every vulnerability or every CVE that we get. And that created our real-time alerts and prior. So let's take a look on how it works. So this is a chart for the first month of data that we collected. We started this about 2 years ago. I remember it was around Christmas of 2017. We had our project almost done, and we let it run for about a month, which was in December of 2017. We went for holidays, and when we came back in January and started analyzing the data, this is what we got. On the x-axis, you have the vulnerability intelligence quotient. So these are essentially this is essentially the weight that is calculated by the analytics engine for each vulnerability. And on the y-axis, what you have is a timeline. And as you can see here, the timeline is just for 1 month. This was just like almost like a test that we did and see what happens with 1 month of data. So we got a lot of data, but we saw some outliers. So the one on the top, at the very top, was for a CVE in the Microsoft malware protection engine, and it was a remote code execution vulnerability, which actually attackers can use to take control of your machine with the help of the malware protection engine, which is essentially supposed to protect you. So we said, okay, that's good. That seems like a high-profile vulnerability, and our system, based on the output of our system, it is on the top. The second vulnerability here in our example was Palo Alto Network's PAN-OS remote code execution vulnerability. Again, same thing. Attacker could use the the remote management interface to perform remote code execution. Again, we thought that, yeah, it is a pretty high-profile vulnerability. We went through a lot of other vulnerabilities in there manually to make sure that the results from our system are good. That generally the vulnerabilities that our researchers thought were high profile are being ranked correctly as high profile by this automated system. So we said, okay, that's a great start, and decided to just keep the system running. So this is essentially these are the various characteristics of the Palo Alto vulnerability or CVE. What you have here is, this is a screenshot from NVD, and what you have here is the CVSS score for that vulnerability. The CVSS score was 9.8, and as you can see, the attack vector was network, which is bad. Attack complexity was low, which is also bad. Privilege required was none. User interaction none, so on and so forth. And we all again, our researchers went through this manually to make sure that there is no bug in this. But what we saw about 5 days later, which is just in the second month of the system being online, is a massive jump in the vulnerability intelligence quotient for about 2 vulnerabilities. So as I mentioned, on the y-axis, you have days. So this chart is plotted per day. And on the x-axis is the vulnerability intelligence quotient. Initially, we thought that something went wrong in the system because for the last month and a half, we had vulnerabilities with their intelligence quotient with 500, 600, 800, something like that. And on around, if I remember correctly, 5th of January in 2018, we had a few vulnerabilities with their weight or intelligence quotient more than 2,500, almost approaching 3,000. Can you guess what vulnerabilities these were? Well, if you guessed Meltdown and Spectre, then you are right, because these were, if you remember, the high-profile Meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities that affected a lot of microprocessors, and there were a lot of side channel based attack vulnerabilities where essentially a process can look or can view data into another process and also cause remote execution. So these vulnerabilities, I think most of us here have been around for like a few years and can still remember the huge impact that these vulnerabilities had on almost in the entire ecosystem, on almost all of us. Desktop systems were affected, servers were affected, laptops were affected. These two, Meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities, affected almost all hardware. So we were really again happy to see that our vulnerability alerting system really gave Meltdown and Spectre a intelligence quotient of more than 2,500, and that was, as you can see from the graph, a very high number. as compared to what it had given before. Now you see two arrows pointing to two dots there. That's because these vulnerabilities were ranked higher for multiple days, and the chart is drawn every day. So a little bit information on Meltdown and Spectre. But soon we realized that the system seems to be working, but we cannot communicate the weight or the vulnerability intelligence quotient in numbers. Like the quotient for Meltdown is 2,700. 2,700 what? That's obviously, it was not self-explanatory. So we decided to have a system that would divide these numbers or these intelligence quotients into various different threat levels, which a normal practitioner can understand easily and quickly. Low, elevated, high, critical. We went with these four. The way these were calculated was, and again, we were calculating in a particular way before. Now we are doing it differently, and I'll talk about that as well. But initially, it was a simple ratio, and once you put your vulnerability intelligence quotient in it, this is what it came out with. So far we had only two vulnerabilities with critical rating, and like a few with medium and then low, and so on and so forth. This was something that we knew from the get-go. We may need to change the formula to essentially divide these intelligence quotients into high, medium, low, and critical. But still, for the first month, when we did some analysis of the data, like essentially compared our alerts with CVSS, we found this. Now again, CVSS, as you know, is the common vulnerability scoring system. And it is amazing. It has helped organizations for the last 20 years enormously. And we internally also use CVSS for various things. But one of the things that, at least for this purpose, CVSS is not useful about is that a lot of vulnerabilities get too high of a rating. And that's because it only considers the fundamental characteristics of the vulnerabilities, the CVSS base score, and does not consider characteristics like if it has been exploited in the wild or how many instances are there in the wild and so on and so forth. And that makes it really difficult to use CVSS as a prioritization mechanism. If you can see in the first month of data, on the left-hand side, we have CVSS, and there we had 96 vulnerabilities, which had the highest criticality between 9 and 10. While our system here on the right had only 4 alerts, which were for 2 vulnerabilities, Meltdown and Spectre. Only 6 alerts for high vulnerabilities, and then only 20 alerts for elevated vulnerabilities. Most of the time, low is vulnerabilities that have really low severity, and most of the time it's even, you could, for all practical purposes of prioritization, to find out what's the most critical vulnerability, ignore this. So going on, this was our 1-year data. Again, same thing. Y-axis has time, x-axis has intelligence quotient. This is internal data. And on the left side, in January of 2018, December of 2017, you can see this 2,500 to 3,000. These were the 2 Spectre and the Meltdown vulnerabilities that we saw. Throughout the year, there were a few vulnerabilities, but none of them touched the vulnerability intelligence quotient that was generated by Spectre and Meltdown. So we almost thought that this was like only a one-time thing where a vulnerability like Spectre or Meltdown comes out. And do we really need to adjust our formula for rating these vulnerabilities into these red, orange, yellow, and green zones? But what happened almost at the end of 2018 was we did get 2 really high-profile vulnerabilities, 2 or actually 4 high-profile vulnerabilities that almost did go to the level of severity of Meltdown Inspector. One of his was the libSSH authentication bypass, and many of you may remember this was a SSH vulnerability where attackers could connect to a SSH server without providing any credentials. So for any Linux users, this was almost like a very devastating vulnerability if your server is configured in a certain configuration and so on and so forth. So there are certain nuances and details that you have to look at it. And the second vulnerability that again got a higher intelligence quotient, which was able to crack and go into that critical vulnerability bucket, was the Apple Mac OS kernel crash vulnerability, which was ICMP packet handling vulnerability. ICMP, as you know, is a protocol where you don't need to authenticate. It's not TCP based either. You can just send ICMP packets to the Mac OS or iOS kernel to essentially crash the device. So there were vulnerabilities that cracked the critical criteria, and we were pretty excited to see that our formula to distribute this vulnerability intelligence quotient into high, medium, low, and critical, that was still holding true. So after 1 year, what we saw was, what we had set out was to get real-time vulnerability alerts, and as you can see, we get vulnerability alerts daily. That is because our sensors collected data daily, gave it to the analytics engine, and reports were generated daily. But also what you can see is that during the same time period, there were about 1,500 vulnerabilities that CVSS ranked as with the highest criticality. CVSS criticalities go from 0 to 10, and there were 1,500 unique vulnerabilities that were ranked 9 to 10. As you know, triaging these 1,500 vulnerabilities times the number of malware that uses them to exploit, times the number of machines that you have, the numbers become quick very fast. While in our system, what we had for the same time period was only 9 vulnerabilities were marked as critical, 35 were marked as high, and 184 were marked as elevated. So as far as prioritization is concerned, I think we were pretty happy with the results that we got. Moving along, I talked about basically fine-tuning the algorithm for dividing these vulnerabilities into low, high, medium, and critical. Again, in this chart, if you observe closely on the left-hand side, you would still see these straight dots which correspond to Spectre and Meltdown. Then almost in the center of the chart, you see some vulnerabilities that we just saw, the Apple iOS and the SSH vulnerability. And in mid-2019, we again got a pretty big spike of vulnerabilities that were able to crack into the critical section. These were the Microsoft Bluekeep RDP remote code execution vulnerability and the WhatsApp remote code execution issue. As you may remember, for Bluekeep, Microsoft mentioned that their telemetry showed that there were about 400,000 endpoints on the internet that their telemetry found were open or were susceptible to these vulnerabilities. So it had a potential to be the next WannaCry or such vulnerabilities which had millions of dollars attached to it because of exploitation. So what we thought was, instead of having, what we thought was making this alerting mechanism or this classification mechanism a little bit more dynamic. And the way it behaves now is that it takes, it stamps the vulnerabilities with high, low, medium, critical, but the numbers change. So as you can see the Microsoft Bluekeep remote code execution vulnerability has the internal threat intelligence quotient of about 3,700, which was a lot more than the Spectre or Meltdown. But also, Spectre and Meltdown affected everyone. Different operating systems, Windows, Linux, various different devices. Whereas the Bluekeep, although it affected 400,000 devices on the internet, it was a Microsoft RDP remote code execution vulnerability, not a hardware-based vulnerability. So what we concluded was that now, not that Bluekeep was any more critical than Spectre or Spectre was any less critical than Bluekeep, but this was attributed just that there is a lot more data being collected by our sensors now, and that is a direct result of a lot more data being generated for these vulnerabilities. So we realized that we need sort of a sliding scale, an algorithm that would slowly change as we collect more and more data. I'm sure 1 year from now, as we are collecting more and more data and more open source data is available, there would be a lot more vulnerabilities that would fall into the urgent or critical section. So now we have changed the algorithm to compensate that. Again, a very familiar chart comparison between CVSS and our data. If you look at CVSS, there were again thousands of alerts, while as compared to the system that we built, there were only 15 alerts. It is a lot more easier to respond to 15 or 54 high profile alerts as compared to responding to thousands and thousands of alerts. So this is the last chart about data. This is all the data that we have from about 2.5 years. As you can see, again, on the left-hand side, you still see Spectre and Meltdown, but they look a little bit short or tiny as compared to the data that we are collecting now. This is what happens when we sort of distribute the data between high, medium, low, and critical. The highest that we have so far is the NSA curveball vulnerability. And I'm sure most of you still have injuries from that curveball. As you know, this vulnerability was a curveball because it was a vulnerability in the PKI infrastructure, in the elliptical curve, and that's why the name curveball, in the elliptical curve algorithm that is used to sign certificates. Essentially, what happened was that, and what could have happened, or what the vulnerability was, that an attacker could sign files, sign website certificates, so that any malicious website could also be reported to the browser or to you as a trusted website. And this vulnerability, in the words of Neil, who is technical director of NSA cybersecurity, this kind of vulnerability may shake our belief in the strength of cryptographic authentication mechanisms and make us question if we really can rely on them. Fortunately, we can. So he had to come out and sort of give a vote of confidence that there is no deficiency in the cryptographic algorithms. It's essentially a weakness in the implementation, and then blah blah blah. There was a lot of explanation about this vulnerability, where if a certain type of elliptical curve is used in generation of the certificates, then one can create a spoof certificate, which when validated can essentially pass validation. So overall, as you can see now, the NSA curveball vulnerability falls into critical. It has a lot higher vulnerability intelligence quotient as compared to Meltdown and Spectre, but we have not changed the criticality on meltdown inspector, even though by today's standard, meltdown inspector would be not critical in our algorithm. They are, as you can see, they are falling into the orange or the second high category. But what we decided was, once we stamp a vulnerability as high, critical, medium, low, these vulnerabilities are stamped as such based on the standard on which they were reported by the alerting system. So we will still keep meltdown inspector as critical, but going forward, as this algorithm changes as more and more to compensate, because we have more and more data being collected constantly. So overall takeaways, if you need like only one slide to take home from this session, that would be this, which is the list of top 10 vulnerabilities in the last 2.5 years that our real-time vulnerability system was able to identify, prioritize, and generate alerts on. There are various vulnerabilities here. I'm not going to go over each of them, and some of them we already talked about in during this session. So where are we, and where are we going? Where are we going to take this project? How can you get your hands on this data and on these alerts and on this vulnerability prioritization scheme? So one of the first thing that we are doing right now is implementing a system which would allow you to have free access, the entire community to have free access to data as well as to the alerts that it generates. So that's the first priority of the current work that is happening. In the future, we also plan to do different type of trendings, as in we are thinking about classification, different types of classification, so that you could set filters that I only want to be alerted on web application vulnerabilities or cloud vulnerabilities, server vulnerabilities, or appliance vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. So this classification would allow users to get top vulnerabilities only from their domain. The second thing that we are looking at is having attack and exploit classification. So adding more information to see how we can attach ransomware data, targeted attacks data, malware data to these vulnerabilities to, again, future expose and enrich the experience that one would have. As well as, last but not least, is the root cause classification to classify what is the root cause for all these vulnerabilities. Lastly, we are also trying to apply various ML and AI type of algorithms and different type of data collection, which is more suited for machine learning. It could be that nowadays you have algorithms that can read blogs, give you information on what the blog is about, and if it is it is a positive blog or it's a negative blog. So more sort of automation of public data. All right, so all in all, that's the real-time vulnerability tracking and prioritization system that we developed. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My Twitter handle is here on the screen, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.